Now, this is very provocative, Charlotte. And start off, there's a lot of common ground that we've covered in, like my book, Deep Medicine, and your new book. And we're also at a time when AI is getting lots of grief, lots of pushback,
Yeah.
blowback, everything. And now you've come out with a book that, this sounds like AI is the cure. So let's start off, if you would. You come up with some great vignettes of patient experience.
Mhm.
And one is Jen Lawson, um, a young woman with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Why don't you take us through that to kind of exemplify where the problems are in medicine today?
Yeah, and I would say, Eric, I don't want to fall into this kind of false dichotomy of either or camps here. I mean, the book is it's a very provocative title in some sense, but basically what I'm trying to do is say what are the problems with current traditional medicine to which AI could potentially be a solution or might not, thinking about the status of current AI. But yeah, Jen Lawson is a patient with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome who, through a series of problems with her health, loses her medical, and she has a very serious fall. She loses her health coverage and basically eats into her pension fund in order to cover her health costs. And as we know, that's not a very uncommon story. So what I do is I open it up with her to discuss the not only the financial barriers to care, which sometimes even get hidden when it comes to thinking about universal healthcare free at the point of access, so to speak, is going to be a solution to all, some of medicine's woes. It will be for some patients, but what I'm trying to say is there are multiple barriers, even given the fact that, say, she's able to get access to care, because she has to rely on her elderly mother to drive her across state to see a specialist at one point. It's very uncomfortable. She has to pay out of pocket in order to do that, because realistically she can't rely on the budget options that would be covered. And she's basically got a whole series of obstacles that prevent her from having comfortable access to care. And then I say, with telemedicine, some of the challenges were eradicated, and she was able comfortably to access some doctors, through with pillows behind her and all the rest of her, where she can sit comfortably. But Jen suffers from sort of not just sort of the literal barriers to care, but figurative barriers too. She discusses some of the biases that do kick in that make it more difficult to see patients with extra needs, and to make them comfortable. And I use that as a vehicle and as a way to discuss the challenges for doctors and nurses and other people to multitask and to do things to make. But ultimately, she exemplifies, to cut a long story short, the inverse care law. That is, for the people most in need, there are more barriers to getting access to bricks and mortar healthcare.
Yeah, no, I think it exemplifies the problem where her 80-year-old mother had to drive her 2.5 hours to get to the doctor, and there was very little time at which she could have. And you get to the point about where medicine, 250,000 people die each year in the United States from errors, and 800,000 from disability, total or deaths. And so this issue that we have today in medicine, summarized by that doctors aren't superheroes. They're
Yeah.
generally, we have a lot of deference, the public, to doctors, and patients are often self-censored about things that they would share. And there's only 18 seconds before they're interrupted to tell their story, and all those sorts of things. So that's the backdrop
Yeah.
to an AI do. And let's get into that now, because you do like a side by side comparison of medicine today
Yep.
versus AI, whereby, for example, doctors get tired, AI is indefatigable, and take us through
Yep.
that by comparison, if you will.
Yeah, so basically the book is follows the trajectory of the traditional medical appointment. So from when you disclose your symptoms to a doctor, and I consider the challenges with that, because sometimes that's overshadowed. And then I look at, as you say, what could technology do as a workaround for that. I also consider um, uh, diagnostics. So the challenges on doctors to keep up to date, the noise in medicine in terms of the range of if you will, disparities in terms of how a doctor might judge you. It could be gender, it could be age, all of these things could be the time of day that can nudge doctors' decisions in different directions. Um, and I consider what AI can do there as well, not just to keep up to date, but also in terms of eliminating some of that noise. But of course, I'm not giving it's not a love letter to technology either, because we know that there's challenges there too. So in a sense, probably I'm irritating a lot both sides in this to some extent. But but trying to be sympathetic to what doctors have to do, and then I also consider empathy. Empathy is a big one, where I think sometimes there's an assumption that, look, and I've done a lot of surveys on this, when it comes to bedside manner, uh, that's a soft skill, and the psychological research shows that it's not particularly easy. But doctors routinely, when I've asked them in surveys, even latterly with generative AI surveys, which task do you think is most likely to be replaced, or least likely to be replaced? The one they always say is the least likely to be replaced is empathy. Around 9 in 10. That's a pretty robust figure in a lot of surveys I've done since 2018. So the point is to say, what can AI do uh, for each of these variety of challenges? And I'm trying to focus into on the more carefully on what the psychological challenges and pitfalls in medicine are.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting your approach here because you basically, review the serious problems we have in the practice of medicine today, and then you get into where AI, could lend a helping hand, and you also review some of the liabilities of AI. So, like you said, it's not a love letter for AI, but there's
No.
a lot of people right now who have antibodies to AI. Like, for
Yeah.
example, there was a Wall Street Journal essay on the 30th of August. A chatbot can be part of your medical team. And this was by Tom Rosenblatt in the Wall Street Journal. And he was basically giving tips to patients about how they could use chatbots. And as you
Yeah.
know, a billion people around the world using chatbots. And of course,
Yeah.
a lot are using it to help their health of themselves or their family members or friends. And you actually reviewed some of that in the book too. But
Yes.
when that was posted, I put it up because I thought it was interesting. There's all these people saying, hard pass. Oh, this is horrible. I don't want an
Yeah.
AI. So we have a lot of problems here with negativism, both from patients, prospective patients, and doctors too, by the way. Now,
Definitely.
very different way. You're not a doctor. You're not a nurse.
No.
You're not, like you said in the book, you don't have any stake in this. You're trying to be an objective, neutral, um, critique, observer.
Yeah.
What think about all this pushback about AI, and what is the basis of it?
So just to say, my background is philosophy. My PhD is philosophy of science and mind. I veered into theoretical psychology, which made me interested in giving a particular portrait of medicine that I felt was missing. Again, for understandable reasons, doctors can't be experts in all things medical, so it's looking at that portrait of the pitfalls, the psychological pitfalls with current medicine. Um, so there is, but then with my philosophical hat on, I'm keen also to take an objective perspective here, and I think there's a big worry I mean, social media and so on can be very vitriolic, and I mean that just sort of showcases the worst, and we know that's a problem in itself. But when I'm in conversation with people, I think there's a hunger for the middle ground. I think many people, and there is this sort of again this bifurcation between both between fear, utter fear, and existential threat on the one hand, and the kind of fantasy on the other, sort of utopia versus dystopia when it comes to AI and healthcare. I think there's understandable reasons why people get emotional about it and upset on both sides. But I also hear, and again, I've been doing a lot of survey research in this, people recognize that you can take a practical perspective that there are going to be some benefits. And of course, no innovation it solves all problems while not inviting new ones. We know this through the history of science. That's just the nature of things. You resolve some problems, you invite many more. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is take some of the concerns that we may have. Here's one of them: discrimination or bias in healthcare. Um, how good are we at actually debiasing doctors? I mean, we do sort of anti-bias training, and so people should monitor their own stereotyping. And the American Medical Association advises that it's pretty ineffectual. So we have to say, if we really care about patient outcomes and things like face-to-face discrimination interfering with diagnostic accuracy or the treatment of patients, say, is there a better workaround to this? And that's where I say, actually, it might be easier to debias some of these tools than it is to debias people. Or you're putting a hell of a burden on a medical doctor in said Dr. Phil parlance, being the best version of themselves. That's very challenging in the frenetic world. We need a realistic, practical conversation about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're making some good points there. I do want to go back to empathy in a moment because that's
Yeah.
something very much unanticipated. I certainly didn't anticipate it. But before I do that, there's a lot of what you referred to, of course, Kasparov's law from my
Yes.
friend Kasparov, that the as everyone knows, he was the Grandmaster chess world champion, and when he lost to the machine, he proclaimed that the best of all worlds is the human and the machine. And in medicine, you may have seen recently that there's been several studies where the AI, and we wrote
Hmm.
Pranav and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this, um, that the AI compared to the doctor with AI,
Yeah.
AI was better.
Yes.
So that doesn't go along with this hybrid thing. And do you think
No.
eventually get to the hybrid model being the best for clinicians?
It's such an interesting talking point. So, what I think has often happened in medicine is there has been this sort of leitmotif. There's no threat here because man and machine will work together. And this is sort of Hallmark esque, Hallmark movie kind of imagery of the doctor and the AI working well together. I mean, well, for years there has been AI in the form of clinical decision support, and it hasn't worked out amazingly well. Doctors tend to override because of the so-called last mile problem. How do you actually get these tools to integrate? That is the sort of $64,000 question. And it's the psychology of the AI and the doctor. So Kasparov's law is interesting because it was a suggestion when he lost to Deep Blue. The thought was, and then you had this era of the centaurs in chess matches where you had weaker humans paired with a strong computer and a strong process, and they were able to beat at the time AI computers. Now, but the lesson for medicine there is um, it's a weaker human. Now, what's interesting is potentially how then do we train doctors? Because if you have, and again, there's just a lot of research that domain experts tend to hold their noses more to algorithmic output. So there's a kind of there's a need here to look at that sort of siloed research on how do humans respond to algorithms. Lay people tend to defer more.
Right.
Um, Experts tend to, it's called algorithmic appreciation, but experts tend to show more algorithmic aversion.
Or
So then
automate.
the issue,
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But then what you're saying as well, perhaps we are also now, because certainly in the chess world, if you follow the analogy or the comparison, the era of centaurs is now over. There's no partnership that beats AI. So again, what you see from those studies is the doctor and the AI together. The doctor tends to hurt the accuracy of the AI, whereas if you leave the AI alone, it's better. And then this invites very, I mean, they're taboo questions, but I mean, why are we keeping the so? But I think we need many more of those studies. It invites questions about what the right partnership is, and something that you've been writing about and thinking about for many years, is certainly in relation to the NHS and education. What training do we actually need? What's the right training in order to work alongside? If that's because that's probably what's going to happen, at least in the medium term. It's already happening, Eric. I mean, just to add to that, I've done survey research in the UK among GPs. 2024, how many? I asked 1,000 GPs with my team, what are you using any generative AI tools for clinical tasks? 20% said yes. We redid the survey 2025, so January this year apart, 25%.
Mm,
Now,
mm,
those are commercial tools like ChatGPT.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they're using them, but then, as you say, are they using them effectively?
So these are the how grounded are clinicians? How are they willing to embrace, uh, and will they ultimately be superseded for certain tasks by the AI alone? I mean, there's so many uncertainties here, but one thing we've seen going back to the patient side
Yeah.
is we see, people develop mental health problems from their interactions. We've seen suicides. We've seen, some really scary stuff that, gets into the heads of people besides the usual concerns about hallucinations, confabulation,
Yes.
all that. What do you say about that?
Yes, so okay, so we do have a slew of articles right now. New York Times has done a lot of these articles, and during the last week. Look, I think it's a serious problem. It's something very we should be very concerned about it. But I also, and this may seem again my sort of philosophical, but let's take a step back, a big picture perspective here, and to say while there may well be harms there, have we shouldn't overly romance what is currently going on when patients lack access to therapists, or because this debate's often more about therapy, in fact, than it is medicine. Um, but also something I've looked at is the evidence base for psychotherapy. Now, consider just for a second if you park all of the challenges with AI and the potential negatives of especially with young people relying on these tools. But psychotherapy, the late great Scott Lilienfeld was one of the few sort of iconoclastic clinical psychologists and researchers who estimated back in 2007 that 10% of therapy led to worse outcomes for patients. It tends to be not that much investigated, the harms that can be done in face to face therapy with a therapist. So there are there can be negative outcomes even if you're seeing a human being. So let's also consider that. It's not as if, and here again, we have this issue of we tend to hold humans to a higher account to AI. So I think there's much, much more work that needs to be done in seeing, again, answering this question of compared to what, who is it useful for? Is it sometimes very helpful for people? Do people also tend to use these tools, be a bit more savvy than we're giving them credit for? Because we've heard these debates before. There's echoes with sort of the Dr. Google stuff, where health professionals came in and sort of said, the doctors, patients won't know how to use Google. Studies show that actually people are pretty savvy about it,
Yeah.
even so-called digital immigrants. But there's also then the issue. I do think that they are probably causing harm to some people,
I,
but I think we've got to consider it in the round. There's much more to think about here.
so I think the point you're getting at, and you did in the book, Dr. Bod, is that, we have to look at it from the broader benefit versus harm ratio. And now, for example, you just discussed where some people could be hurt.
Yeah.
could be overriding benefit. But also, for example, going back to what we or talked about earlier with medical errors, there's a lot of human medical errors, and we don't tend to acknowledge that. The medical
No.
profession, doesn't. And so, yeah, AI will make errors too, but is it a fraction? Is it, so
Yes.
this comparator is a really important,
I
this
think
kind
it's critical.
that you
Yeah.
get. But I think people should keep that in mind. Now, empathy.
Yes.
This is a surprise town because when we thought about empathy, machines don't have it. Okay,
No.
we but they can channel empathy because they're trained by all the everything that's on the internet and Wikipedia and every other thing that's been written, hundreds of thousands of books and whatnot. So it turns out that the patient can understand at least the sense that the AI is empathetic about their medical condition. And as you point out, and there's now several studies that show
Yeah.
the same, is that when rated by doctors, when rated by patients, the
Yeah.
empathy appears much more impressive from the AI than by the doctors. Now that
Yeah.
doesn't fit with our model in a way. And of course, what is it real? Is it? What do you think is the explanation for this repetitive observation?
So it's just such an interest. I'm glad that we're talking about empathy. So a few thoughts that I have on this. Um, First of all, empathy is as I say, it's a very hard thing to get right. Empathy isn't all it's cracked up to be either. So psychologists and neuroscientists and philosophers have actually written about this for a number of years. Empathy tends to be biased. So we tend to be more empathetic to people who are like us. There's also actual physical constraints on the number of people we can be genuinely empathetic to, in the sort of in the kind of bells and whistles empathy where we feel what they're feeling, we understand what's going on in their lives and all the rest of it. um, so the key issue, I'd say, Eric, is what do we mean by empathy? Because we can't measure what we haven't first defined. And empathy tends to mean a couple of things. It can be that kind of catching the emotions of someone, so emotional empathy. Now, some medical educators say, or Rita Sharon is one of them, that you should feel something of what doctors should feel what patients are feeling. But there are other kinds of empathy, and there's what's called cognitive empathy. So that is just grasping the emotional state of the patient, and then there's no point in sort of grasping it if you're not acting in a pro-social or sympathetic way. So it's actually behaving in a particular way. Now, if we assume, even if we sort of park the bias and all the limitations and the burnout that comes with empathy, actually, if you ask patients what they want from doctors, they tend not to want the emotional empathy. I mean, I've done a small study on this. It was an experimental setup. It has various limitations, but there's other survey research to support this. But again, it's very restricted because people don't often interrogate this idea of empathy in medicine. But they don't want their doctor to be a sort of fellow tragedian in their suffering, weeping with them or feeling. They want them to be professional. But so they want cognitive empathy, grasping what you're going through, but also feeling, showing compassion for you, behaving a particular way. But that enters the door then to, can AI do those things? And
Right.
it doesn't have to feel anything, but it can. And the studies are showing it can identify your emotional state and it can actually display a certain amount of what looks like compassion. Now, here's the interesting thing, those surveys were blinded, where people said the ChatGPT or different tools look to be much more empathetic. But when you actually unblind and you say, well, look, that was it. So that AI surpasses humans. And also says fewer inappropriate comment things as well to patients. When you unblind it, that drops. So there's University of Southern California study which found actually when you do the reveal, it's about the same level. Now, that of preference, humans who are a bit more quirky in their inconsistent in their empathy versus the more slick AI. But that introduces the issue of, you know, at scale can we do this, and will people actually get used to AI and they see it as in a particular way? Um, but also, I think there's this again the false dichotomy. It does it have to be a multitasking doctor who has to deliver all of these things, including empathy? I don't think anyone goes through, spends $250,000 to become an empathizer. Go through medical school. So there's a lot of issues there with who do we want to empathize. Those are big questions.
Yeah,
Um,
that doesn't get into the human touch story about when you're, human to human bond, which is a
yeah,
very different what you're ever gonna get from reading the chatbot's output. But, this is a big topic because it's even been proposed, I don't know what you think about it, that
mhm,
doctors coached for empathy by AI. That is, where you go through the conversation and you say the AI reviews it and say, "Well, Dr. Jones, why didn't you ask the patient about that? Why did you interrupt the patient so about this?" And, basically coaching
yeah.
clinicians be better humans. Is that realistic or is that just crazy?
I think it's, in some sense, large language models are just one giant plagiarism machine. They're standing on the shoulders of previous human beings. So, in some sense, it's sort of, by extension, the intention could be viewed as the intention to be compassionate. I mean, that's taking quite a long lens to it. But I discuss that in the book. And yes, there are programs where people are using these tools within training. And I think that that's a bit, whatever is in the benefit of patients and can improve delivery of some of compassion, and if you put it in those sorts of terms, I think it's got to be a good thing. If you consider younger people who are going through medical school, they may not have an awful lot of life experience with death or chronic illness. And these two, or addiction, or all kinds of things to which uh, I say, if these tools are useful, and I suspect aside from formalized within medical education training programs, which I know some are doing, some educators are doing, but from my surveys, I suspect that's actually probably in the era of online record access. I suspect that's a chief use when it comes to writing documentation that doctors know patients will read, writing it in an accessible and an empathetic way.
Right. Well, Professor Blease, I should say Charlotte, the great book, Dr. Bot. It's a very optimistic view of how AI can lead to transformation of better medicine. I think during our conversation this morning, or this evening for you in your this is clear you have a very balanced, very thoughtful view about this. This is a work in progress. It's still very early in this generative AI, even large language reasoning models. We're in the earliest stages. So perhaps, we're trying to speculate what are the issues, where it can go. But I give you a lot of credit for, putting together a whole book with lots of research, citing lots of other research, and we'll see how it plays out. But obviously, it's highly controversial right now, and there's,
Mhm.
people, as you say, it's nice to be in the middle, but there's a lot of
Yep.
ends. I tend to be optimistic in the long view
Yep.
side. I think you are as well, right?
That's definitely my angle. I mean, I take the view that the technology now is the worst it's ever going to be. I certainly don't think we're there yet. But I also close the book by saying, look, I'm considering certain psychological challenges that doctors face in patients with a traditional visit, but there's a much wider conversation. Those aren't the only ethical concerns. It's about who do we want to run our health systems, what happens to privacy, inequality, what's the point in having diagnostic accuracy if you can't pay for medications, or have sanitary, you're not living in sanitary conditions. So there are enormous issues that I think, as a society, and civic conversations that we need to have, which is why we shouldn't postpone those, and why this is a nice opportunity. We have
Yeah.
to keep talking about them.
Well, thank you so much for joining today. I'm sorry that we had problems initially,
Me
connecting, but
too.
the station has been really, very think very worthwhile. You got your pulse on a lot of the key issues surrounding the integration of AI in the future of medicine. I know you'll stay on it. And I know this is just your second book. The first one was
Yeah,
No Effect. And I'm sure there's many more books in store for you. So thanks so much for on ground today.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Eric. It's great to meet. Thank you.
And thanks for everyone joining today. And sorry again for the problems that we had in initially connecting. We'll look forward to your comments, and we'll have this as an archive so everyone can see at their convenience. Thanks, everybody.